This is part 2 of my dissertation subject field exam. First one, is really part 4, is sustainability as the framework. Certainly there'll be a number of different occasions, but I think Dr. Litke was appropriate in suggesting that a number of the authors that are out there now, of global importance, really these are issues that are across the board. So we are talking about Thomas Friedman's work, Lex in the Olive Tree, but I've also heard that the world is flat 3.0 and hot, flat, and crowded 2.0, why we need a green revolution. I'm proposing that they may very well be as appropriate. Dr. Litke also mentioned Planet of Slums by Mike Davis, and I do think, again, that's a pandemic issue that really holds everything back. You know, the more you read, I think it was possibly Thomas Friedman's work, Lex in the Olive Tree, where he was saying that, you know, you could redistribute all the wealth you want, but there's simply not enough wealth to go around to not have everyone be poor. Certainly half the world lives on less than $2 a day, but you know, capitalism requires growth, and that's what makes things rather tricky in this situation. We have to keep kind of feeding the beast a little bit, and I think that's a difficult situation because, frankly, that means we're going to continue to increase our use of resources, going back to the economics aspect. Another that was recommended was How to Run the World by Parag Khanna, and I think he does a good job of framing the issues, both the ones that are across the board. He has a very interesting idea on, shall we say, going medieval. And what I think he's suggesting in that case is really that even though we're under a case of globalization that Thomas Friedman talks about so much, that also means that we tend to get more focused on areas that we can control, and those are usually smaller borders. Things like political states are becoming somewhat obsolete when you consider how many cultures and styles there are. Another one I found influential in our reading along the way has been popular is Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, which again I think takes a larger look at the issue. And as well, I haven't read it yet, but Collapse, How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed. So with those, then we go on to a little bit more, let's call it abstract perspective. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But what we're looking at is, you know, really most popular done by Al Gore with An Inconvenient Truth, but also we have other issues. Hubbard's peak refers to the scientist Hubbard, who suggested that really once it becomes more expensive to pump the oil out of the ground than it does to sell it, well, we're not going to have a gradual decline. It's going to collapse. And that's really an important question because, frankly, before I got into this program, I thought to myself, technology will be the answer. Humans will just sort of follow along in that aspect. If you consider that the economic crisis will, shall we say, dismantle Thomas Friedman's discussion of the herd, well then we've got a real problem. The people who are really, shall we say, moving the financial markets that can create and destroy the place. Somewhat more product-based is William McDonough's work, Cradle to Cradle, which really goes along and follows a product really from creation to its eventual laying place in the landfill. It doesn't always have to be this way, obviously, but it's important to recognize the materials that go into the product. Somewhat more abstract is Thomas Kuhn's work, which I previously referred to, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. You know, it's interesting how many books were coming out in the late 50s, 60s that were really kind of turning things on their head. When I read this, I almost took for granted the idea of paradigm shift, but I guess that's what happened, frankly, when a paradigm shifts. So this whole idea that there'll potentially be breakthroughs and then we'll all think of things differently, I think is an important concept, as well as what he refers to as puzzle solving, which is those of us who are really more ensconced in improvements of efficiency. So I think how we go about that as humans, how we think about things for scientific breakthroughs is as influential on how we see our resources as the actual resources themselves. Michel Foucault, dizzying work, but I like the order of things. I think what he was kind of suggesting here is that, you know, he's going across disciplines, but he's also saying that man needs to be studied. You know, rather than just become, let's call it anthropocentric, you know, we're really looking at studying ourselves within the context of the creation we divided. I kind of talked earlier about how, you know, if aliens came down this planet 150 years ago, they would think we were crazy for developing our electric systems, putting lines in the ground, frankly running things on oil that burn, heat the atmosphere. All things being equal, I'd like to think that we should study ourselves and how we come up with solutions. So that's the framework for sustainability. And now we move on to what I consider more of an existing condition as well. And that is urban studies. Again, we could slice the pie 100 different ways, but really I'm looking at the image of the city, Kevin Lynch, why downtowns matter. This was really more of a planning statement. Cities like Boston, their landmarks are really important. Frankly, you just point to things as opposed to everything being a drawn-out map. There are also some questions about whether you all think urban planning works at all, frankly. It's great to plan, but as I think it was Eisenhower said, as soon as the battle begins, you pretty much throw out the plans. And I think that's important, and why I chose someone else like Colin Rowe and Fred Ketter's work, Collage City. And this goes to the idea, frankly, that we build upon ourselves. It's an organic nature. It's bricolage. And in this kind of situation, Collage City, they're saying things build upon themselves. They talked about, I know Camillo Sitti in his 1889 work, City Planning According to Artistic Principles. It's the difference between a Middle Eastern setting where things are turned inward, or where you build upon the neighbor, kind of like accretion, as opposed to an overhaul like Paris and Baron von Haussmann. So those two, I think, are very important in planning, growth, and design, as well as David Rusk's work, Cities Without Suburbs, which I think you could imagine really has to do with where does the boundary begin and end to our city, not just our downtown. This crawling, non-boundary driven setting that places look to Portland, Oregon because of their urban growth boundary, which has worked. Well, the question is, how is that impacting what we're trying to save? And then a couple of the longer-term heavy hitters, obviously, are Jane Jacobs, when we talk about organic, with her response to the bigger plans, obviously driven by the housing and urban development, her response in trying to protect her beloved New York and Toronto, for that matter. She was effectively saying people matter, how they live matters, it's not just the buildings themselves. And I think that's important because that goes back to my work with really how will the people work with this? It's not just a matter of efficiency of technology. And then Lewis Mumford, kind of cranky, crabby fella, had opinions on everything, wrote for 70 years. I'm going to have to glean his work a little more because I don't always agree with him, and I do think some of it's dated. But I do think technique and civilization is good, as well as some of his conversations about the usefulness of planning. So with that, and also obviously Max Weber had written on bureaucracy, Thorsten Veblen's work, which is more sociological based. So the next one we move on to is political philosophy. I don't want to get too heavy into these, but the reason why I chose these three in particular, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, I think his conversations on the origins of inequality and its importance to American democracy really becomes important because, depending on whether you see all men as created equal or we're born unequal for different conditions and what we seek to strive, I think that striving says a lot about the statement about how our cities are either being held on to or let go. I also think it relates to Karl Marx in the sense of the contrast, the dialectic between the haves and have-nots, why they have and why they don't have. Marx obviously got into more of the process about why things are, what will eventually happen. It doesn't mean I buy into everything he says, but all things being equal, I think his work is important for understanding the flow of information. So those are there. John Stuart Mill, obviously, utilitarianism. I think we have a burning desire to try to quantify everything that doesn't have to be quantified. We're always trying to measure. And so that becomes an argument about humans in the age of technology and the fact that, maybe some things are just not meant to be quantified. So utilitarianism has its role, but I don't buy it, especially into the greatest sum of all happiness, things like that. But I do think panopticon and panopticism by Foucault are important conversations on that. Other political economy books I don't have here because they're about 1,000 pages and probably block out the screen. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, but also the complementary book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, where he was really trying to balance out what he considered our interests, that the butcher doesn't cut and the baker doesn't bake because of altruism, but for their own interest. So those are some of the political economy. Obviously, Robert Haubrunner wrote The Worldly Philosophers, which is a summary book of the most important historic economic thought. And then I also have Todd Buchholz, because that is New Ideas from Dead Economists, which is the Introduction to Modern Economic Thought. I think it's well written, and it's good reading for MBA programs, which I encountered, as well as Reinventing the Bazaar. This is about a natural history of markets. I think these have a good level of depth. Like I said, I've elected to shy away a little bit from kind of the hardcore economic thought. Go ahead. And then ethically, we do have, I could go into these, but frankly, I do believe that virtue as excellence in the striving of habit is essential. So Aristotle's really become a key player to my work. Freeman's discussion of Kantian capitalism really brings that into the fold, in the sense that, similar to John Rawls, I do think there is a certain level that has to be achieved in these programs, and we have to make sure that the floor keeps rising slightly as far as a bare minimum for all people in our ethics of duty. I don't think Kant's work is personal enough, but I do think it has a good, strong sense of duty, which from a business point of view is helpful. Back onto that idea of caring and sense, we do have Jeannie Litke's work and Carl Freeman. Carl Freeman's work was really about what if we all had an equal stake, as opposed to just punishing those who are treated like externalities. And then Jeannie Litke's work is really a question of feminist morality. What is it just to care? Forget all this philosophy talk, forget all this shoulda, woulda, coulda. What if we just cared about each other? What kind of system would we create? I haven't read the books yet on pragmatism, but I do know they're very American-based. They're of an interesting period, about 1900 to 1920, when business was really taking off. You might say the Industrial Revolution had somewhat matured in its own way at that point, or at least gone through the most basics of the Dickensian period. But gentlemen like Santayana and James, what does it mean to be pragmatic? And frankly, because pragmatic but ethic is important to me, I want to go from there. And the final slide for this part has to do with the tension between technology and tradition. And simply put, I'm going to go with In the Age of the Smart Machine, The Future of Work and Power by Zuboff. The technological society, because I think LL is right in that we're sort of we're being molded into accepting technology more strongly. And I think Postman's Technopoly does a similar take. Heidegger is kind of the basis, I do believe, his conversation on the basic definition to me is we should have or recommendation is we should have a free relationship with technology. And then Peter Drucker, who I believe in, has also written Technology, Management, and Society. Preservation books are really more about, frankly, more the technical aspect of it. And so there'll be some about historical building construction and others about facades, which is some of my base work, and then about more modern issues about the environment. This came out in 2011. People Are Penguins by William Baxter, that type of thing. What it won't be, though, is it won't be Heritage So Rich, and it won't be Preservation Magazine, so to speak. And what I'm talking about is, I'm not trying to market preservation. I'm not trying to make a case for why buildings are interesting. I think that's already kind of covered, and I've also done that sort of in my previous work. Heritage So Rich is the study that came out in '66 that helped create historic preservation as a study, maybe say paradigm shift, similar. I'm not as interested in trying to reshape how preservation is seen at this time. So the final one is, frankly, as I said, philosophy goes as a background. It's not really going to be attempted as a theoretical paper, but really some of the underpinnings I've already talked about: philosophy of technology, Rousseau's work, Kant's work. So pragmatic philosophy. This is how I kind of see these parts interworking in the background, but not so much straight ahead. We'll move on to part 5 in the third presentation. Looks like we're out of time on this slide as well, and we'll conclude with that one. Thank you.